With 4 days to the 2023 general elections, Nigeria faces a redefining moment that will determine the future of the West African country. With the high spate of insecurity and economic hardships that has bedeviled the nation, Nigerians seem to be decisive about taking the reins of leadership from the men who have held onto it for so long but have gotten us nowhere. On Sunday, 19 February 2023, the Rootstv Media Group Inc., in association with the Rootstv, organized a presidential debate for candidates vying for the highest office in Nigeria. Only 3 of the 9 presidential candidates invited for the presidential debate were in attendance, including the African Democratic Congress flag bearer, Dumebi Kachukwu, Prince Adewale Adebayo of the Social Democratic Party, and African Action Congress, Omoyele Sowore. The debate was moderated by 4 seasoned non-partisan Nigerian journalists based in America, Sonola Olumense, Professor Oke Ndibe, Professor Farouk Erogi, and Rudolph Okonkwo. The candidates answered questions and shared their vision for Nigeria across the different sectors of the economy, including fuel subsidy, education, multidimensional poverty, and insecurity.
There seems to be a coalescence of sentiments around the idea that fuel subsidy should be done away with. All the presidential candidates that I have heard, from PDP to APC to Labour Party, appear united in saying that we should do away with fuel subsidies. But the discussions often ignore the fact that Nigeria is a petrol-dependent economy, and that what usually passes for taking away fuel subsidy is a hike in the prices of petroleum. And we know the consequences this has on the economy, on everyday people. So I want to ask each and every one of you here to talk about your ideas about fuel subsidy. Are you going to take away fuel subsidy if you have the opportunity to rule Nigeria? If yes, what is the model that inspires that?
The question has never been about the relevance of fuel subsidy. The challenge we've had as a country is the fact that this has been a gaping hole where a few briefcase billionaires have used to siphon billions of naira from our country. Our law enforcement in the last decade has not been able to put a stop to this. Rather than let a whole nation continue to pay for the crimes of a few people, most people now advocate for the removal of fuel subsidy, and so that they can put the gains in a transparent process that benefits most Nigerians. So if I were to remove fuel subsidy, I'll put what we gain into social infrastructure like transportation, education, healthcare, and what have you. The Jonathan government, when they tried to remove fuel subsidy, we saw them bringing in a lot of buses, trying to ramp up the development of our rail system. But Nigerians didn't buy into that at that time, and we had a lot of protest. We still see the same problems today. What they experienced then is what we still experience today. We speak about fuel subsidy, but we have disparate pricing across Nigeria. What we pay for fuel in Lagos is not what they pay in Adamawa or in Port Harcourt or in Aba. So because we have disparate pricing across the country, we know that subsidy is not uniform. Some people are paying more for this price, for this petrol price. So if we still have this problem in an import-dependent economy, in an oil-producing nation, we need to start looking at mechanisms that we can use to solve this problem. We then need to go away from PMS and start looking at alternative sources of energy like CNG or PNG or what have you. We need to start looking at the gases, to power our vehicles. We then also need to start bringing in more refineries. We've spoken about refineries for too long in Nigeria, and one begins to wonder, is refining a rocket science? Nations that don't produce oil are importing crude oil and they are refining. How does it make sense that a country like Nigeria that produces crude oil, that we can't refine petroleum products? But let me tell you one of the biggest challenges. Every year, we have almost 100 billion naira, they say, that goes into the refineries. They still don't work. but nobody has paid any price. We've not seen anybody charged to court. And because of this, because this becomes a pipe that they used to siphon funds, nothing happens. So we need to plug those holes. While we accept that we need to protect our people, we also know that we cannot continue leaving a few briefcase billionaires to continue to ruin our nation. In the last 1 year, we saw the liberalization of AGO and aviation fuel. We are dealing with it. We've plugged that loophole. For PMS, we need more time to do this so we can put in place the social infrastructure that will support our people when we take this out.
We don't need to subsidize petrol by importing. The best ways to subsidize petrol is by local production. If you want to subsidize something, a long-lasting way for your people is to give internal capacity to produce it. So the first thing to do is to give internal capacity to produce our own domestic consumption. One, by making sure that the 4 refineries work, 2 in Port Harcourt, 1 in Warri, 1 in Kaduna, and they could work under an O&M contract anytime. Secondly, technology has improved now for refining products. So with a cracker on a modular refinery, you should be able, in 18 months, even for some of them, you can wheel them across the sea. So you should be able to put about 20, even if you lease them, they will start producing enough for you.
We are not doubting or disagreeing that subsidy is relevant. But in a nation that is fantastically corrupt, where we have seen that law enforcement has not been able to stem or do anything about the corruption in the subsidy process, that's why we are looking at taking out subsidy, even though it's going to cost us a lot in terms of how it affects the poor. If you look at the structure of NMPC today, how will I want to tackle the fraud that is going on there if we are liberalizing the sector, right? And you have people being able to bring in products. If government wants to subsidize the products, you subsidize at source. That's at the point they come into the country. But if you see what happened 10 years ago, we had disparate records about the vessels that came in. Even the multinational companies that manage our ports were implicated in that process. So we have looked at this and said, because our people, the process is so corrupt, that's why we need to do away with this. Do away with this completely, take that money and start seeing how we can support those who really need that subsidy. You mentioned that there's subsidy in transportation process in system in America. That's why we said that if we have social systems like that, we need to subsidize those processes instead of subsidizing the people who are importing, inflating the figures and taking away billions of naira. But yes, subsidy is absolutely relevant. If you know the price or how the removal of subsidy in diesel or in aviation fuel has affected Nigeria, nobody speaks about that. Now you have big men, a lot of people who use diesel generators are going using this fireman petrol generator, making noise all over the place and polluting the environment. But it's a big cost on our industries and it's affecting Nigeria greatly. And this is because we are not able to manage the corruption. If we say dedicate personnel, dedicate manpower, and use technology and processes to face or tackle the corruption, how long before we get there? This is what we are faced. No matter the person we bring into EFCC, ICPC, and the police and what have you, they have been unable to combat this multi-billion-dollar fraud that goes on there. This is why we say take away this money and let's reinvest this money into other areas that we can at least see that it's getting to the right people who need it.
After 2012, we found out that the idea itself is a scam, and this was simple. There was a protest in Nigeria, well, I would say globally, against the Jonathan regime regarding petroleum subsidy. And when the protest was over, they came around and said they have found out that it was a scam and actually arrested people. Well, they started prosecuting them, and I can tell you nobody was ever jailed for that scam. One of the things we found out about petroleum subsidy was that most of the people who were importing fuel weren't really importing fuel. Some of them, and that was the most dramatic of it all, said they were importing fuel in a vehicle that has sank 20 years before. Yes, that was what we found out in those days. And it's the same way I feel today, that they are not subsidizing subsidy. And it has even got official. The Nigerian Customs Service, NCS, said they have not been able to verify that Nigerians are consuming 61 million, I think, liters of fuel. They confronted the NNPC with it, and the NNPC has not denied it. The second aspect of it, which I'll quickly round up, is that as of yesterday, the NNPC is now saying that even though over 6 trillion naira was budgeted for petroleum subsidy, the Nigerian government doesn't pay for it. So they deduct, according to the GMD of NNPC, now it's a limited liability company, that they are the ones doing the deduction. The government budgets for it, but they don't pay them. And that's the basis for them not remitting a dime into the federation account from the NNPC. That's where we are. All of this is a scam.
So the question that I have for the three candidates, and I'll like Mr. Showore to begin, is what do you see as the central problems in the country's educational sector, and as succinctly as possible, what kind of policy prescriptions would you have to address those?
Well, there are two things involved. One is funding for public education, but I also think it must be clearly stated that the problem with public education is not limited to tertiary institutions. There are over 20 million kids who are out of school, primary and secondary schools. And there's also a question of how many students do you have in tertiary institutions. When we did our research, we found out there are 1.7 million students who are students in tertiary institutions. And this spread across both public tertiary institutions and private. So if you look at what is in the public, we're talking about almost 1 million students, and there are about 700,000 students in private institutions. So it's a question of funding. And when I was a student leader in the 90s, the Academic Staff Union of Nigerian Universities were asking for 1.9 billion naira just so that they can take care of all the needs in federal institutions in our days. And this was around 1992, 1993. Yes. The money was never made available to them.
Okay, I think that the major challenge we have with education in Nigeria is that we have not redefined education for the modern day, and we have not redefined education for the future that we want for Nigeria. When China decided that they wanted to be an industrial giant, they had to redefine education to support their vision. We don't have a vision that we've tied our education charter to, and that's one of the greatest challenges. You started by talking about the ASU strike. Yes, the ASU strike had its merits on both sides, but one of the greatest challenges you have within the education sector is the fact that those who lead us, those who manage our processes, there's a huge disconnect. So what will I do as a solution, right? We need to ensure that those who lead us actually feel the pains of those who they lead. I have long proposed Nigerian Patriot Act, which simply states that public officials, those directors of companies that derive their operating license from government, their families, their children, they must all go to public schools. They must not use generators in their houses. They must not have boreholes in their houses. They must travel by road unless it's an emergency. Now, if we can make those who lead us feel what the poor man feels or experiences, what will happen is that as Nigerians, we will all come together and within a short time ensure that we are properly funding key sectors or solving the problems in those sectors. Finally, in education, we have this notion in Nigeria that education must be funded by government. No, those of you who are based in America, you understand that education is funded by private parties also. Their endowments, grants, and what have you. What are our rich doing to support the educational sector? During the Jonathan government, I proposed then that if you take all the senatorial districts, look at all the institutions we have there and identify all their big men in that district, come up with the requirements that they need there, be it IT infrastructure, be it schools and what have you, reduce it into a plan and a budget and get these people to fund in addition to what government is doing. Then you begin to see something that is working.
When it comes to our education, it's like we are debating not how to heal the patient who has malaria, but how to regulate the temperature of patients of malaria. So that's what we discuss. We don't discuss educational policy. We discuss industrial relations in the tertiary institutions. That's all. ASU. That's not the problem. ASU is a symptom of a bigger problem. The bigger problem in Nigeria is that we have no government in place. What we call government is not a government. When you run a government properly and you make social investment and you give educational sector the requisite minimum investment that you need to give, you have accountability and clear freedom from at least an attempt to reduce corruption to the minimum, and you let the universities have their autonomy. ASU will not go on strike. I know ASU members, they are not crazy people. They love the job. The reason why they are there in the first place is because they love the job. They have alternatives. So the problem is that the government is not a government. The government is anti-education. So what we will do, once you elect a proper government, an SDP government, the first thing we do is that we give education its due in the proper appropriation. To have a more organic approach to our educational system is that we will have, for the first time, a reasonable autonomy for the universities, heavy investment in social sector education. For example, to discuss the salary of lecturers without tying it to possession power, without tying it to the living condition, without tying to other amenities which you require to function as an upper middle class professor or senior lecturer, is not complete. Fourthly, we have to deal with the issue of the fact that the lecturers are tired of lying. The ASU strike is bad, but it's not the worst. The worst is giving somebody a degree in chemistry who cannot titrate, giving somebody a degree in computer science who doesn't have even a computer set. So this is what the university wants us to address, and they are easy to address. If you take 10% of the money that EFCC claims that it has been seizing, if you put that money as special fund into education, all of these things will disappear.
The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2063 of the African Union both regard this problem of poverty and inequality very highly. My question to each of you, beginning with Debayo, is this: what will you do and how will you make sure that your response or proposed response to this question of poverty and inequality works?
And Nigeria being poor, I'm not surprised that we're the poverty capital of the world, we are the corruption capital of the world, we are the robbery capital of the world. So people have been robbed of their entitlement for 60 years, they are bound to be poor. But the good thing is that poverty can leave this generation by, one, stopping the robbery, making investment in social sector, making sure that we invest in agriculture, we invest in things that make people poor, housing, we invest in generating full employment. There's a way I can rewrite the current budget when we come in. If you rewrite the current budget and you take the procurement away and rewrite it, we will be able to lift at least 60 million people out of poverty. So the most important thing is that poverty here is not an accident. It is a government policy that brought people to be poor. The country itself doesn't want you to be poor. Poverty can be programmatically reduced and eliminated in Nigeria, but you have to have good governance that is making social investment in things that make people poor. And that is very clear. If you don't do it, you can be part of the statistics for World Bank or anybody forever.
I believe that Nigeria is running out of time on how to deal with the poor in Nigeria. I believe that we have less than 6 months to deal with the poverty rate we have in Nigeria before Nigeria begins to implode. How do we deal with poverty? First of all, government has to begin to understand that government has to provide an enabling environment for all her citizenry to thrive. That's the role of government. If we understand that, government has to now begin to look at all our assets and how to activate those assets so that Nigerians can build upon the assets as a foundation for them to thrive in the year 2023. It will interest you to know that we still in this year continue to export raw materials to other nations, whereas what we ought to be doing to create jobs in Nigeria is for us to ensure that those companies that need those raw materials, they should come into Nigeria and produce and manufacture in Nigeria. If we look at the service-based industries where we see Nigerians are thriving, like artists and what have you, what is government really doing to build platforms like Fiverr, Freelancer, and what have you, so that people can stay at home with good broadband service and export their skill sets all over the world? What are we doing with tourism? Our big men leave Nigeria to Miami, the Caribbean, and what have you, for the same water that we have passing Echo here. There are so many areas that we can use to begin to create employment for our unemployed.
We've seen increased bloodshed all over the country, and it appears that every year is more insecure than the previous year. So what policies, programs, thoughts, perspectives, insights do you guys have on how to bring about lasting security in the country? How to reverse the theaters of bloodshed that continue to envelop the country?
Okay, first of all, we have to understand that what's going on with security stems from, one, our economic challenges, two, our divisions as a people that are based on tribe, tongue, and religion, three, the fact that we have an extremely porous border, four, we have a president whose body language seems to suggest that his kith and kin from any part of the world can waltz into our country, live in our country, take over our farmlands, and do whatever they need to do in Nigeria. If we understand all this, then we now begin to know how to tackle security. I believe that we don't have enough personnel on ground to deal with the different theaters of war we have across Nigeria. I will immediately bring on board 200,000 men and women from the civil defense and police, because they are already trained in the art of carrying weapons to complement the war effort we have now. I will then immediately go after those who come in through our borders. We need to start bringing up those walls, and we need to start using technology, drones, USVs, and UGVs to tackle the porousness of our borders. We also need to understand the role that budgeting has played in the current warfare. President Jonathan had 100 billion naira internal security budget, which President Buhari inherited. He has not increased, even though the war and the theaters of war have increased and have spread. And he's not implementing 50% of that budget. We need to fund security properly. If you remember what happened with the Kaduna train bombing, imagine a situation where you have to do about 8 sorties a day to monitor that train line. And because the cost of aviation fuel has increased, because of the cost of diesel has increased, and you're not getting enough funding, you reduce the sorties to 2 or 3 a day. The terrorists understand that you have reduced it, they know your pattern, and they attack when they know that you are not there. That's why you hear that you have 100 motorcycles and vehicles going across Nigeria with hundreds of people and nobody sees them, because we are not properly funded. We need to fund these people more. And then Nigerians need to understand that Nigeria is at war. We are one of the only nations in the world where we are at war, and most people don't actually believe we are at war until the war gets to their doorstep. If we are at war, if we understand what we are at war, the local gathering of intelligence will improve to help our security agencies. Then our security agencies need to be more coordinated. We have a non-functioning NSA now that has not helped the war effort. It just seems to exist on paper, and that's why there's no serious coordination amongst the different security agencies. Then, as president of Nigeria, my body language will clearly say to all Nigerians that any Nigerian life lost will be avenged. I will go after anyone. I'll make clear to everyone that a Nigerian life is precious to me, and I will protect all Nigerian lives.
What is happening in Nigeria, if you want to know, that Nigeria is a territory of different economic warlords, socio-political warlords. So Nigerian elite, as we call them, even though they look like us, they have the same skin with us, some of them are relatives, they are actually like drug lords who have shared the country into territory. So what you find you call insecurity is like you go to Miami in the days of cocaine trade, and warlords are fighting over territory. That's number one. So the first thing you need to do is to form a government that the warlords are not fighting over that government. That's what is happening in Nigeria, number one. And number two is that the warlords in Nigeria, some of them are representative of international concerns. So we need to take care of our national security in such a way that our land is not a territory where a militarized version of the Berlin Conference scramble for Africa. There's a scramble for Nigeria, of which Nigerian politicians and political elite are part of that. Some acting for themselves, some acting for foreign agents. Second is that the security architecture, it doesn't need funding. And I disagree with you maybe in that regard. It's not the funding. They are well funded, but the funding is looting. And to say that there's no coordination, there's coordination in security. They may be coordinated by a young man who used to sell a recharge card, but it's being coordinated somewhere. And the coordination is based on appropriation and spending. If you look at the amount of money being spent off balance sheet, it's a very serious amount of money. The third issue is dealing with intelligence.
The first most important security that we don't discuss in Nigeria is the security of persons in terms of their economic security. And when you don't take care of that, ensure that people have jobs, they get their pension paid on time, and they have some form of security that shows that when they're vulnerable, the system is out there for them. If you don't take care of that one at first, it doesn't matter how many bullets you have. It's to also look at what are the low-hanging fruits for security. For instance, to fight security. For instance, why is it that the nation of Nigeria with 200 million people don't have drones that can track and attack? The only drone base on the continent of Africa is based in Mali, is owned by the US. The US will tell you, because we meet them all the time, the agents in town will tell you that if they want to wipe out Boko Haram, it will take less than 1 week. And this is because they have solid intelligence of their location, their movements. They have infrared equipments all over Nigeria every time. But their interest is not to save Nigeria. Their interest is to colonize or recolonize Nigeria. So they're asking Nigeria for a base, the African base, for them to help Nigeria.
But we're going to give you one more stab at the microphone in 45 seconds per man. Give us your closing remarks. What are you offering Nigerians as an overall? What is your final offer you're making to Nigerians for this election, 2023?
The internal fights we're having that destroy our people, the regional fights we have, the community clashes we have will stop when we understand that we are one people. We are not one people. We need to tackle that headlong. As your president, I will immediately tackle the unemployment issue headlong. Over 40 to 60 million Nigerians who are unemployed, hopeless, helpless, not knowing what to do on a daily basis, nobody supporting them, nobody pointing them in the right direction. We need to retool these people, we need to repurpose these people, we need to let these people know that they are important. Nations identify their people as their assets. In Nigeria, our key assets seem to be oil and gas and our other solid minerals. I will let Nigerians know that Nigerian people are the real assets of Nigeria. In understanding that they are our assets, we will then use our God-given minerals to work for the Nigerian people and not the other way around.
We just need to come together and solve our problems. They are human problems. Our problems are anthropomorphic. We cause them by ourselves. If you look at our environment, everything, nature is prepared for us to have a good time in Nigeria. What we need to do is form a government that resembles a government. Too many ungoverned spaces in Nigeria and too many untouched lives in Nigeria. And what we need to do, we can be debating ideas. Any of the set of ideas will work. If it leads to an honest leader setting up a cabinet of honest citizens willing to help and the public service that is organized to render services, not to take their own cut from the bleeding of the Nigerian people. And I will plead with Nigerians that every 4 years, there's always one film trick or the other. 2015, when I was talking that Buhari was a disaster, people who have been my friends for many years said that I was anti-Islamist, I was anti-North, I was this and that. And now they say I'm a prophet. If you ask them to look for a prophet, they will call me. The same thing is about to happen now. People are carried away by emotion. The governance is based on rationality. And a country has both domestic and foreign enemies.
Nigeria is not a nation. Don't let anybody deceive. It's just a country with boundaries and statistical, components. When it becomes a nation, it will be able to address so many of these issues. And the second part is that we have institutional problems. We have issues of security, power, education, and employment, economic equality, and cultural issues that has to be resolved. But until also we become a nation, that will not be addressed. And in addressing this, you must also put in place a government or leaders who understand this, not rulers. And that is what all these people we have here today are all about. I'm sure you all tried to reach out to all the candidates, 18 of them. But as of this morning, those 18 candidates have become, I think, 12, because 5 other candidates have endorsed another candidate. And by next week, more candidates would have endorsed other candidates. That's also part of the politics that we are fighting against here. And what is important is to look at this important forum and start to take a decision. Starting from today, we're likely to have election on Saturday, but I'm not sure, and I want to confess here, that the National Electoral Commission or the Nigerian Electoral Commission is not prepared for a Saturday election. I don't know how they're going to do it with people not having money. There's no gasoline to even take electoral materials to their locations, and there are not people trained already, ready to operate what they need to do.
All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody that joined us, the candidates and moderators.